I used to think betrayal would come with a warning, a suspicious text, a late-night work meeting, a lipstick mark that didn't belong to me. But the moment my life split cleanly into before and after didn't arrive quietly. It arrived under chandeliers, surrounded by crystal glasses, violin music, and the kind of wealthy smiles that look polite until they turn sharp. At my ex-boyfriend's wedding, a wedding my brother helped destroy my life to make possible to my brother. I still remember how the ballroom smelled like roses and money, how my parents sat in the front row, tense but triumphant, as if they'd successfully pulled off a performance. How my brother, Zachary, stood beside the groom, my groom, once, wearing that smug confidence he'd carried his whole life, the confidence my parents fed like it was oxygen. And my ex, Nate, stood there in a custom suit, looking like a man who believed he'd won something. He had, but not because he was in love, because he thought love was a shortcut to inheritance. Everyone in that room had been told a clean story, that Nate and I amicably broke up, that he met Zachary later, that their relationship was fate. And my parents begged me, no, pressured me, to attend and give a speech so nobody would ask questions. They wanted me smiling. They wanted me graceful. They wanted me to make their lie feel real. I agreed, not because I forgave them, because I was tired of being painted as the bitter ex-girlfriend who couldn't move on. So when the DJ called my name and I stepped forward, I felt my heartbeat in my fingertips. The room blurred at the edges. Nate's grandparents, wealthy, powerful, the kind of people who could change a life with a signature, watched me like they were watching a documentary they didn't know they were in. I looked at my brother, I looked at Nate, and I realized something terrifyingly simple. If I stayed silent, I'd be helping them steal more than my relationship. I'd be helping them steal the truth. So I smiled, lifted the microphone, and said the one thing my family prayed I would never say out loud. I'd like to tell everyone how the groom and I really broke up, and how my brother and he really started. And the entire room went silent. My name is Kylie. I'm 28, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like reliable and steady, as if my biggest strength is that I don't cause problems. I grew up in a house where causing problems was treated like a sin. Not because my parents were strict about morals, but because drama was inconvenient for them. It disrupted the picture they wanted to show the world. A perfect family, 2 sons, polite smiles, holiday cards. The only issue was, I wasn't one of the sons. I was the daughter who learned early that peace in our house didn't come from love. It came from compliance. And then there was Zachary, my older brother. Zachary was 32 when all of this happened, but he'd been the same person since we were kids, charming when he wanted something, cold when he didn't. He knew how to tilt his head and soften his voice and make adults think he was misunderstood. He knew how to turn any mistake into someone else's fault. And my parents, they didn't just forgive him. They protected him. If Zachary quit another job, it was because they didn't appreciate his talent. If Zachary borrowed money, it was because he was going through a phase. If Zachary hurt someone, it was because he didn't mean it like that. Meanwhile, I was praised for being mature and independent, which in our family basically meant, don't ask for anything, don't need anything, don't make us choose. So I didn't. I studied hard. I took a stable job as a software developer, the kind of job that doesn't sound glamorous at dinner parties but pays rent on time. I built a life that was mine. Quiet, predictable, safe. And then, 3 years ago, I met Nate. It was at my best friend's housewarming party, one of those cozy gatherings where everyone brings wine and pretends they're grown-ups. Nate stood out immediately, not because he was the loudest guy in the room, but because he had that magnetic kind of confidence that feels like warmth. He listened when I spoke. He laughed at my dry jokes like they were clever. When he looked at me, I felt seen. I remember leaving that night with my cheeks hurting from smiling. For the first 6 months, it was the kind of relationship people envy from the outside. We did slow Sundays and late-night takeout. He held my hand in public like he was proud to be with me. He talked about the future like it was a real place we were both walking toward. He wasn't reckless like Zachary. He seemed ambitious, social, polished. There was just one detail I couldn't ignore. Nate came from old money. Not comfortable money, not vacation house money. His grandparents had built a tech company back in the 80s, something that turned into generational wealth. Nate worked there as a senior marketing executive, and people in our social circle whispered that the job title came with the last name. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't want his money. I didn't need rescuing. I'd built my own stability. And he seemed, at least in the beginning, like he wasn't shallow about it. But then the comments started. Small ones, casual ones, the kind of sentences that sound like jokes until you realize they're not. He'd walk through our modest apartment and say things like, "Imagine what we could do with a bigger place, somewhere that feels more us." He'd scroll through Instagram and show me photos of his friends' vacations and say, "We should be traveling like that. You only live once." If I said I was happy where we were, he'd tilt his head and smile like I was adorable for thinking small. And the one thing he mentioned more than he should have, more than any normal person would, was his grandparents' approval. He would say it lightly, like it was trivia. "They just want me to settle down with someone responsible. They're old school. They care about appearances. They want stability." But then, sometimes he'd let the real edge slip through. "If they approve of you, they'll help us set up our life, like, really set it up." It was always framed like a bonus, a prize, a gift. But it started to feel like a test I didn't agree to take. About a year into dating Nate, we moved in together. I remember my parents acting hesitant at first, concerned even, until they met Nate's family and suddenly became very supportive. My mother started asking questions about his grandparents in that overly sweet voice. My father made little comments about good connections. It was subtle, but I could feel it, the way they stood taller when his family was mentioned. And then Zachary started showing up more. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Zachary was between jobs again, which meant he was bored, and boredom always made him roam. He'd drop by unannounced, stay too long, eat our food like he lived there. He'd sit on my couch with that relaxed posture like the world owed him comfort. At first, Nate seemed amused by him. They had this immediate chemistry, two charming men playing off each other. Zachary told stories, exaggerated like always, and Nate laughed like Zachary was the funniest person he'd ever met. I should have felt relieved, like, good, my boyfriend and my brother get along. But something in my stomach stayed tight. Then I noticed Nate would get different when Zachary came around. More energetic, more talkative, almost like he was performing, trying to impress. Zachary, too, would show up dressed nicer than usual, wearing cologne, acting like the version of himself he used for strangers. And then came the moments that didn't make sense. Nate would be extra dressed up on days Zachary visited, like he had somewhere important to be, even if we were just sitting at home. They'd talk about investments and big moves while I was working in the other room. Sometimes their voices would lower when I entered, like my presence was an interruption. And once, just once, I walked into the kitchen and heard Zachary say, laughing, "You deserve better than boring." Nate didn't deny it. He just smiled. When I asked what they were talking about, Zachary shrugged like I was paranoid. Nate kissed my forehead and said, "Nothing, babe, we're just messing around." And I believed them, not because my instincts were silent, because I'd been trained my whole life to doubt myself before I ever doubted Zachary. I kept telling myself, he's my brother. He wouldn't. And Nate? Nate would look at me like I was home, until the day I came home early with a migraine, and heard laughter coming from my bedroom. There's a moment before betrayal reveals itself. A quiet stretch of time where nothing has happened yet, but your body already knows something is wrong. That's where I lived for months. After Zachary started coming around more often, my apartment no longer felt like mine. It felt watched, like every normal moment was being observed, measured, evaluated by people who didn't have my best interests at heart. At first, the changes were subtle enough to explain away. Nate would come home later than usual and say he'd run into Zachary for drinks. Zachary would suddenly know details about my schedule that I didn't remember sharing. They started texting more, quick glances at phones, screens turned away instinctively. Whenever I asked, the answers were always smooth. Just guy stuff. Career talk. You know how your brother is. And every time I hesitated, I felt ridiculous for even asking. Because who suspects their own brother? I noticed how Nate started comparing me, softly, indirectly, to people I didn't know. He'd say things like, "Zachary thinks I should take more risks," or "Zachary says I'm playing it too safe." Sometimes it was framed like advice, sometimes like criticism. Once, during dinner, Nate laughed and said, "You're so practical. That's why you're good for me." Good for me. Not exciting, not inspiring. Just stabilizing. I smiled, because that's what women like me are taught to do when men compliment us with limitations. Then came the little jabs that didn't feel accidental anymore. If I declined a last-minute weekend trip, Nate would sigh and say, "You're always so cautious." If I said I was tired, he'd say, "You sound like you're 40." Zachary would back him up with jokes. "Careful, man. She's going to put you on a budget next." Some people just aren't built for big dreams. They'd laugh, and I'd feel that familiar pressure in my chest, the one that told me I was the odd one out in my own home. Still, I stayed. Because every time I tried to talk to Nate about how those comments made me feel, he'd soften. He'd pull me close and say, "You're overthinking. You know I love you." And I wanted to believe that love meant safety. What scared me most wasn't the possibility that something was happening between them. It was how easily they dismissed me. The way my discomfort was treated like a personality flaw. The way Zachary's opinion carried more weight than my feelings. The first time I truly felt afraid, not angry, not jealous, but afraid, was a Thursday afternoon. I was working from home, headphones on, deep in code. I went to refill my coffee and froze halfway down the hallway. Nate and Zachary were sitting at the kitchen table, too close. Their voices dropped when they heard me. Zachary leaned back, smirking, like he'd just said something clever. Nate's face flushed, not embarrassed, but energized. I caught a single sentence before they noticed me. "She doesn't have to know everything." The room went quiet. Nate turned around too quickly. "Hey, babe," he said, overly cheerful. "Didn't hear you." Zachary just grinned. "We were talking about investments, boring stuff." I nodded, because confrontation has always felt like stepping onto thin ice. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling while Nate slept beside me, his arm heavy across my waist, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I told myself this was just insecurity, that I was projecting old family dynamics onto my relationship, that Zachary wasn't capable of that kind of betrayal, that Nate wouldn't risk everything we'd built. I repeated those thoughts like a mantra. But something inside me had already shifted. I stopped sharing certain things. I became quieter, more observant. I noticed how Nate seemed to light up when Zachary praised him, and how he grew distant when I expressed doubt. And then there was the morning everything shattered. A migraine hit me so hard I had to leave work early. I didn't text, I didn't call. I just wanted to lie down in my own bed, in my own quiet. As I unlocked the apartment door, I heard laughter. From my bedroom. Not startled laughter, not guilty laughter, comfortable laughter. And in that instant, before I even opened the door, I knew. Not suspected. Knew. Because betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly, until you're weak enough to walk straight into it. I don't remember closing the door behind me. I don't remember taking my shoes off. What I remember is the sound of laughter, warm, familiar, intimate, coming from a place that was supposed to be mine. Each step down the hallway felt unreal, like my body was moving ahead of my mind. The migraine pulsed behind my eyes, but even that pain faded compared to the dread settling in my chest. I told myself, one last time, that there had to be an explanation. A stupid one, an innocent one. Anything but the truth, my instincts were screaming. My hand was shaking when I touched the bedroom door. Not because I was afraid, because some part of me was still hoping I was wrong. I pushed it open. Nate was in my bed, and standing beside him was a woman I'd never seen before. Not scrambling, not panicking, not even surprised. They looked up at me like I'd walked in on a meeting they hadn't expected to be interrupted. Nate was propped against my pillows. My pillows, his shirt half off, his expression more annoyed than ashamed. Zachary sat beside him, relaxed, unapologetic, wearing that same smug smile he'd worn our entire lives whenever he got away with something. For a second, none of us spoke. The room smelled like my laundry detergent, like home, like betrayal. My vision tunneled, my ears rang. I felt the blood drain from my hands so fast they went numb. "What is this?" I finally managed. Nate sighed. Actually sighed, like I'd asked an inconvenient question. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out," he said, rubbing his face. Zachary chuckled softly. "Yeah, rough timing." Rough timing. I felt something inside me tear, not dramatically, not loudly, but cleanly, like a rope snapping under too much weight. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely recognizable as my own. Nate glanced at Zachary, then back at me. "A while." Zachary didn't bother pretending. "A few months." "A few months." While I cooked dinner, while I worked late, while I defended both of them in my own head. I laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming until I couldn't breathe. "You're serious," I said. "You're actually serious." Nate sat up straighter, like he was preparing a presentation. "We didn't plan for this to hurt you," he said. "It just happened." Zachary added, casually, "We understand each other. We want the same things." I stared at them, my brother and the man I loved, sitting comfortably in the wreckage of my life. "Get dressed," I said. "Both of you, get out." Nate frowned. "Kylie, let's talk about this like adults." That was the moment something inside me went cold. Adults don't sleep with their partner's sibling, I said quietly. Adults don't lie for months and then act inconvenienced when they're caught. Zachary's smile faded for just a second. You're overreacting. There it was. The same sentence my parents had used my whole life whenever Zachary crossed a line. Nate swung his legs off the bed. You have to understand, he said, lowering his voice like he was being generous. Zachary gets me. He understands the kind of life I want. You're great, but you're different. Different. Not enough. Not ambitious enough. Not exciting enough. Not worthy enough to stand beside him in the future he'd already planned without me. So this was about money, I said, suddenly clear, about the inheritance. Zachary laughed. You always were quick. Nate didn't deny it. He just looked relieved, like I'd finally caught up. Zachary knows how to connect me with the right people, he said. Someone my grandparents will respect. And that someone is my brother, I whispered. Zachary shrugged. I don't see the problem. It's not like you were going to use that lifestyle anyway. I felt my hands curl into fists. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I walked to the closet, grabbed a suitcase, and started throwing clothes into it, whatever I could reach. Nate watched me like I was making a dramatic mistake. You're being emotional, he said. No, I replied, zipping the bag shut. I'm being done. As I walked out, Zachary called after me, almost amused. Try not to make this messy. I turned around then, looked at both of them one last time. You already did, I said. I left without another word. And as the door closed behind me, I realized something terrifying and freeing all at once. This wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the moment I stopped protecting people who never protected me. The first thing I noticed after I left was how loud the world felt. Every sound seemed too sharp. The hum of traffic, the click of my turn signal, my own breathing in the car as I drove without really seeing the road. I pulled over twice because my hands wouldn't stop shaking, because my chest felt too tight to hold air. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I ended up at my friend Maya's apartment, someone I hadn't seen much lately because life had gotten busy, and Nate always seemed lukewarm about her. When she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and let me in. I collapsed on her couch and cried until my throat burned. Not loud sobs, quiet, shaking ones, the kind that feel like they're coming from somewhere deeper than your lungs. I should have known, I kept saying. I should have seen it. Maya didn't interrupt. She just sat beside me and held my hand while I unraveled the story in fragments. Zachary, the whispers, the bedroom, the way neither of them had even tried to apologize. That night I didn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment I'd dismissed. Every time I'd swallowed discomfort because I didn't want to be difficult. Every time I'd convinced myself that love meant patience, even when patience felt like erasure. By morning, my phone was full of messages. From Nate first. You didn't have to leave like that. We can talk this through. I still care about you. Then from Zachary. This didn't have to blow up. You're being dramatic. Don't turn this into a family issue. That message hurt the most. Because it confirmed what I already knew. He didn't see what he'd done as wrong. He saw my reaction as the problem. A few hours later, my parents called. I ignored the first call, and the second, and the third. When I finally answered, my mother didn't ask how I was. She sighed heavily and said, We heard what happened. My stomach dropped. You heard their version, I said. My father cleared his throat. Your brother says you walked in on something that wasn't meant to hurt you. I closed my eyes. He was sleeping with my boyfriend, I said. In my bed. There was a pause. Not shock, not outrage. Calculation. Well, my mother said slowly, these things happen. Relationships end. With your son? I asked. Kylie, she replied, her voice tightening. We need to think practically. Nate's family is very influential. This could get complicated. That was the moment I realized they weren't calling to comfort me. They were calling to manage damage. To who? I asked. To everyone, my father said. We don't want gossip. I felt sick. So let me get this straight, I said. I get cheated on. By my brother. And I'm supposed to stay quiet so nobody feels uncomfortable. You don't need to be so emotional, my mother said. This doesn't have to ruin relationships. But it already had. I hung up. The next few days blurred together. I took time off work. I slept in Maya's guest room. I avoided mirrors because I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Eyes dull, shoulders hunched, like I was bracing for a hit that kept coming. But beneath the grief, something else started to surface. Anger. Not explosive rage, but a slow, steady burn. Every time I thought about Nate's annoyance instead of guilt. Every time I remembered Zachary's smug smile. every time my parents minimized what had been done to me. I realized something terrifying. This wasn't a single betrayal, it was a pattern. And for the first time in my life, I stopped asking what I could have done differently. Instead, I asked a different question. Why did they all expect me to accept this? The answer scared me, because it meant the confrontation I'd avoided my entire life was coming. I thought the worst part would be discovering the betrayal. I was wrong. The worst part was watching how easily everyone rearranged the story to make me the inconvenience. By the end of that week, the narrative had already shifted, quietly, efficiently, like damage control in a boardroom. Zachary stopped calling me directly. Instead, he started talking to our parents, to extended family, to people I hadn't spoken to in years. And suddenly, I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. I was the one who couldn't let go, the one making things awkward, the one turning a private situation into a family problem. It started with my mother. She called one afternoon while I was sitting at Maya's kitchen table, trying to force myself to eat soup I couldn't taste. "Kylie," she said too calmly, "your brother and Nate are very serious." I didn't answer right away. "And?" I finally said. "And dragging this out is only going to make things worse," she continued. "For everyone." "For who exactly?" I asked. She sighed. "You know how people talk. Nate's grandparents are traditional. They care about appearances." That word again, appearances. "So you want me to pretend this never happened," I said, "so Zachary can marry the man who cheated on me." "Kylie," my father cut in. He'd been on speaker the whole time. "No one is asking you to pretend. Just be graceful." Graceful. The same word they'd used my entire life whenever Zachary crossed a line. "I was graceful when I stayed quiet," I said. "I was graceful when I left without causing a scene. I was graceful when I didn't tell anyone what really happened." "And that should be enough," my mother said quickly. "There's no need to embarrass anyone further." That's when it hit me. They weren't afraid of hurting me. They were afraid of losing access to Nate's money, his connections, his grandparents' approval. My silence wasn't about healing. It was about convenience. A few days later, I got the wedding invitation. Cream-colored cardstock. Gold lettering. Zachary and Nate's names printed side by side like they'd always belonged there. The date circled in elegant script. I stared at it until my hands started shaking. Then my parents showed up at Maya's apartment, unannounced. My mother cried as soon as she saw me. My father stood stiffly, jaw clenched. "We need you there," my mom said, gripping my hands too tightly. "People will notice if you're not." "I'm not going," I said. My father's voice hardened. "You don't understand the position this puts us in." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "You want me to smile so no one asks how my boyfriend ended up with my brother." They exchanged a look. My mother lowered her voice. "If you don't come, people will assume you're bitter." I laughed then, a sharp, humorless sound. "I am bitter," I said. "I was betrayed." "Kylie," my father snapped, "you're being selfish." That word landed like a slap. Selfish. For refusing to protect the people who destroyed me. They begged. They guilt-tripped. They reminded me of everything they'd done for me growing up. They said family comes first. They said I was putting my brother's future at risk. And finally, when none of that worked, they said the quiet part out loud. "Nate's grandparents don't know the full story," my mother said carefully. "They believe Nate and you broke up before anything happened with Zachary." I felt my stomach drop. "So you lied to them," I said. "We simplified things," my father corrected. I stood up. "You want me to stand in front of people who were lied to and help keep lying," I said slowly. "We want you to help us move forward," my mother said. Something inside me went very still. I realized then that this wasn't just about Nate or Zachary. This was about my entire role in this family, the one who absorbs pain quietly, the one who smooths things over, the one who sacrifices comfort so others can save face. I looked at them and said the words I'd never said before. "I won't protect him anymore." My mother's face fell. My father's voice turned cold. "Think very carefully about this." I did, and after 3 nights of not sleeping, of replaying my life like evidence in a trial, I made a decision that scared me more than anything else I'd ever done. I would go to the wedding. Not to forgive, not to reconcile, but because if they wanted silence, they should have treated me with respect when they still had it. The week before the wedding was the darkest stretch of my life. Not because I doubted what had been done to me, but because I finally understood how alone I was in my own family. Once I told my parents I would attend the wedding, their relief was immediate. Too immediate. They didn't ask how I was feeling. They didn't ask what I needed. They just started talking logistics, what I'd wear, where I'd sit, whether I'd be willing to say a few kind words. That was when it became painfully clear. They didn't want me there. They wanted my presence. A prop, a seal of approval. proof that everything was fine. At night, I lay awake in Maya's guest room, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click softly as it turned. My chest felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and replaced with air. I replayed my entire life in fragments. Every holiday where Zachary's mistakes were smoothed over, every time I was told to be the bigger person, every moment I swallowed anger so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I asked myself questions I'd avoided for years. If this had happened to me with anyone else, would they still expect silence? If Zachary were the one betrayed, would they ask him to smile and attend? I already knew the answers. Nate didn't contact me during that time. Zachary did, once. A late-night text. "I don't know why you're doing this. You're making everything harder than it needs to be." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Harder for who? For the man who cheated? For the brother who betrayed me? For the parents who lied to protect them? Or harder for the woman who finally refused to disappear quietly? The night before the wedding, my mother called. Her voice was softer than usual, dangerously soft. "Please," she said, "just don't cause a scene." That sentence settled in my chest like a weight, because she wasn't asking me to be kind. She was asking me to be small. After the call ended, I locked myself in the bathroom and sat on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest. For the first time since everything happened, I let myself imagine what tomorrow would feel like. Walking into that room, seeing Nate's grandparents, the people who held his future in their hands, watching Zachary stand there like he hadn't destroyed something sacred. I imagined myself smiling, applauding, clapping politely as if none of it mattered. And something inside me broke. I realized that if I stayed silent tomorrow, I would be betraying myself in a way I might never recover from. But the fear was overwhelming. Fear of being labeled dramatic. Fear of being cut off from my family completely. Fear of standing alone in a room full of people who didn't want to hear the truth. I sat there shaking, whispering to myself, "You don't have to do this. You can just leave. You can disappear." But another voice, quieter, steadier, answered back. "You've been disappearing your whole life." That night, I didn't sleep at all. I got dressed in silence the next morning. My hands trembled as I zipped my dress. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Eyes sharper, posture straighter, like someone who'd finally reached the end of tolerance. When I arrived at the venue, the building gleamed with wealth. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, guests in tailored suits and designer dresses laughing easily, unaware of the lie they were celebrating. As I took my seat, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. This was the lowest point, not because I was powerless, but because I was standing at the edge of a choice that would change everything. And once I spoke, there would be no going back. The speeches came after dinner. I barely tasted the food. Every bite sat heavy in my stomach, as if my body already knew it wasn't meant to stay. The room glowed with soft lighting and expensive happiness, crystal glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling in easy waves. Zachary looked relaxed, confident, like a man who believed the worst had already passed. Nate stood beside him, smiling toward the front table where his grandparents sat. Elegant, composed, watching everything with the calm authority of people who had never needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. My parents sat nearby, visibly tense now. My mother kept adjusting her necklace. My father's knee bounced under the table. They knew. When the DJ announced it was time for family speeches, my heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought I might faint. I felt every step as I walked toward the microphone, felt the fabric of my dress brush against my legs, felt the heat of the lights on my skin, felt dozens of eyes settle on me. The room went quiet. I wrapped my fingers around the microphone and took a breath. "For those of you who don't know me," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me, "I'm Kylie. I was with Nate for 3 years." A murmur rippled through the room. Curiosity, not discomfort yet. "I was asked to speak today because family is important," I continued, "because appearances matter, because sometimes silence is mistaken for grace." I glanced at Zachary. He smiled nervously. "But I've learned something over the past few months," I said. "Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it just means the truth hasn't caught up yet." The room stilled. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke slowly, deliberately, like I was laying evidence on a table. "Nate and I didn't part amicably," I said, "and found him in my bed, while my brother stood there helping him lie." The sound that followed wasn't gasps. It was shock, the kind that knocks the breath out of a room. Zachary's face drained of color. Nate froze. "I didn't share this to hurt anyone," I continued. "I shared it because many of you were told a different story, one that made this wedding possible." I turned slightly, just enough to look at Nate's grandparents. I respect you enough to believe you deserve the truth about the people standing in front of you. The silence was deafening. Nate's grandmother's lips parted slightly. His grandfather's jaw tightened. I finished calmly. Love built on betrayal isn't love, it's convenience. And I refuse to protect a lie that cost me my dignity. I placed the microphone back on its stand. I didn't wait for applause. I walked out. Behind me, chaos erupted. Raised voices, chairs scraping, the wedding planner rushing forward too late. I stepped outside into the cool air and felt my lungs fill for the first time in months. My hands were shaking, but my spine was straight. I didn't cry. I sat on the steps and waited, not knowing for what. Minutes later, Nate's grandparents walked past me without a word. Their expressions were carved from stone. They left, and in that moment, I knew something irreversible had just happened. Not because I'd ruined anything, but because the truth had finally been allowed into the room. I didn't see the explosion. I felt it, like a distant tremor moving through the ground while I sat outside, breathing in air that suddenly felt lighter. My phone started vibrating in my hand before I even stood up. Missed calls, texts stacking on top of each other, my mother's name flashing over and over again. I didn't answer, because for the first time in my life, the chaos wasn't mine to manage. Inside that ballroom, everything unraveled quickly. I learned the details later, piecemeal, through people who didn't know which side they were supposed to be on anymore. Nate's grandparents didn't raise their voices. They didn't confront anyone publicly. They didn't cause a scene. They simply stood up and left. That alone was enough to fracture the room. Guests whispered. Phones came out. The carefully rehearsed timeline of the evening collapsed under the weight of unanswered questions. Zachary tried to follow them. Panic etched across his face, but security gently and firmly blocked his path. Nate stayed frozen near the altar, his confidence evaporating by the second. My parents were the loud ones. My mother cried openly, her face flushed with humiliation. My father argued with anyone who would listen, insisting that I had misrepresented the situation, that I was emotional, that I had gone too far. Too far for telling the truth. Within an hour, the reception was effectively over, and then the real consequences began. By the next morning, the story had spread far beyond the wedding. Nate's grandparents cut contact immediately, not just socially, professionally. An emergency board meeting was called at the company Nate worked for. By the end of the week, he was removed from his role, pending review. The inheritance, something Nate had spoken about like a guarantee, was put under reconsideration. Zachary lost more than he ever expected. The lifestyle he'd already started planning, luxury apartments, expensive cars, a future funded by money he hadn't earned, collapsed overnight. He quit his job months earlier, confident he wouldn't need one once the inheritance came through. Now, he couldn't even afford his own rent. And my parents? They turned their anger toward me with a precision that almost impressed me. They showed up at my workplace unannounced, demanding I fix this. They accused me of sabotaging my brother's future out of jealousy. My father said I'd embarrassed the family. My mother said I'd destroyed everything they'd worked for. I listened once, just once. Then I said something that finally stopped them mid-sentence. You chose him, I said, and I'm done choosing you. I blocked their numbers that same night. The messages didn't stop, but they couldn't reach me anymore. Zachary tried next. Drunk, rambling, angry. He screamed about how I'd ruined his life, how I'd stolen his chance at an easy future, how I owed him because I was younger and had my career together. He admitted, without realizing it, that he'd pursued Nate because of the inheritance. He laughed when he said it. That was the moment I stopped feeling guilty altogether. Over the following weeks, the fallout spread outward like ripples. Friends distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Zachary's social circle fractured under the weight of public embarrassment. Nate retreated completely, posting vague messages online about betrayal and being misunderstood. No one defended them the way they expected, because lies collapse faster when they're exposed in bright light. I moved out of Maya's apartment and into a small place of my own. Nothing fancy, but quiet, safe, mine. And as everything around them fell apart, something unexpected happened to me. I slept. I laughed again. I stopped bracing for impact. I didn't win anything. I simply stopped losing myself. And that, I realized, was more powerful than any inheritance they'd ever chased. 6 months later, my life looks nothing like the one I thought I was building. And for the first time, that doesn't scare me. I live in a small, one-bedroom apartment across the city. Sunlight in the mornings, quiet at night. I furnished it slowly, intentionally. Everything here has a purpose. Everything here belongs to me. Zachary is still living with my parents, unemployed, bitter, telling anyone who will listen that I destroyed his life out of jealousy. My parents, from what I hear through extended family, are exhausted, angry at the world, angry at me, but mostly angry that the future they'd imagined for him collapsed so publicly. They wanted me to fix it. I didn't. Nate reached out once, a long message, carefully worded, full of regret that felt incomplete. He said he'd learned a lot, that he finally understood why I was hurt, that he missed me. I didn't respond. Because the truth is, I didn't lose a relationship that day. I lost the illusion that being quiet would protect me. I lost the belief that love meant tolerating disrespect. And I lost the role my family had written for me, the one where I existed to absorb discomfort so others could remain comfortable. What I gained was quieter, but stronger. I gained self-respect. I gained the ability to walk away without explaining myself. I gained clarity about the kind of partner I'll choose in the future, someone who doesn't see me as an obstacle to their ambition, or a problem to manage, or a supporting character in their story. And I learned something I wish someone had told me earlier. You are not obligated to protect people who are willing to sacrifice your dignity for their convenience. Walking away doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. It means you finally chose yourself. If you're watching this and wondering whether you're overreacting to something that made you feel small, dismissed, or disrespected, listen to that feeling. It's not drama. It's information. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave the room where the lie is being celebrated.